Hi, I'm Ian and welcome to the JCDecaux Digital Changemakers podcast. I've been invited to host this podcast to highlight the latest trends marketers should know about and interview senior leaders to ask the challenging questions we're all thinking. I want to share insights that will inspire senior marketers to push the boundaries on their marketing strategies and become digital changemakers in their organization. So what's on the agenda for this latest episode? Recession. It's been on the horizon for a long time, and it's something that is part of a normal economic cycle. But given how sharply inflation has risen after Brexit, COVID, and now the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis is a real threat to life as we know it. How can we separate how we feel or how to deal with our situation as individuals from how we deal with our situation as a brand? How do we shift our mindset from consumer to investor? Today, we'll be discussing what advertisers and brands should consider when the term recession is looming, and how winning brands have navigated recessions in the past. I'm joined by Rajvi Kantaria, Director of Marketing at JCDecaux, to turn the questioning towards me from my own perspective as an analyst.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for letting me come and interview you again today.
Not at all.
We've been seeing a lot in the headlines recently. It's a scary time for some people. We've been seeing the headlines about inflation hitting 15% today. We've got obviously the energy price hikes. We've got interest rates rising, but at the same time, we're seeing petrol prices dropping actually, and mortgage criteria being relaxed a bit. And so we're seeing quite a lot happening at the moment. Can you tell us, as your kind of role as an analyst, what is happening? Can you summarize a little bit of what we're seeing at the moment?
Sure. And just to start off, I'm not a sort of an economist by training, which actually might be good in some ways on this. I think, joking aside, I think you've got a real mixture of signals that are being sent out at the moment. Yeah. The phrase that has been used is, if this is a recession, then it's a very unusual recession, because what you have is, yes, you have certain indicators such as inflation going up, your consumer confidence has been going down, but at the same time, jobs data has been very strong when you look at things. Then also as well, you do have an issue here of overall wage inflation hasn't kept up with price inflation. But then that depends on which part of the scale you're at. If you actually look at the ONS data, you'll see that real wages have been dropping at sort of record levels compared with the inflation rate. But when you include bonuses, which obviously are towards the higher end of the population, the wage earning population, then actually it's slightly above. So, what you've really got here is a lot of polarization that is going on at the forefront. The inflation issue is interesting because if you look at some of the things that have actually been driving inflation, some of them still remain very elevated, and so forth. You've got wage inflation, which is obviously coming through as well. But you've got some things which have come back down. Certainly at the time of this recording, the price of oil has been coming down. Also as well in terms of prices of wheat, for example, has been coming down and so forth. The fact that you've got some growing concerns about sort of a global recession, weakness in China as well. So the cost of commodities has also been coming down as well. So there's really a large number of effects that are coming through. I think if you were to sum it up in one or two sentences, what you'd say is probably the world is in a bit of a state of flux at the moment. Both in terms of the events that have happened in terms of COVID, and then also as well now the war in Ukraine. But I think also as well, just more generally, in terms of some of the trends that have been more prevalent for the past 40 years, perhaps in the way that we look at things and sort of the world order is, some of those things are changing as well. And all that is coming together sort of at one time with COVID really being the trigger for a lot of the changes.
Definitely. And I suppose this all affects consumers in different ways, doesn't it? So different consumer groups are affected differently. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because you touched on a little bit that, wages may be different for different groups and things like that. So could you talk a little bit more about the disparities perhaps in how this affects different groups of people?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look, actually, one thing that we would say is a key characteristic of what's happening at the moment is the real polarization of the consumer. As you say, I mean, you have consumers who are certainly the lowest income deciles, are really struggling with the effects of energy bills, rising food prices and so forth. At the other end, look at the results from luxury goods companies. Yeah, places like Western Europe, North America, yeah, beaten expectations. Yeah, really, really strong sets of numbers. Yeah, to use one example, watches of Switzerland. Yeah, they talk about the fact that essentially sort of demand is far outstripping supply, and the waiting list is absolutely long. So the luxury, the high end of the market, things are going, the consumer's doing well. And I think, yeah, if you look at the two different categories, yeah, let's take that higher end first. Yeah, first of all, first thing to actually recognize is they actually did very well out of COVID. You think about sort of all the government intervention schemes and so forth, that was fine. But really where they benefited from was the rise in the increase of assets. Yeah, the Bank of England's quantitative easing program, sort of one of the key effects of that was essentially to push up the value of all assets, whether that be stocks, whether that be housing prices, whether that be people's pensions and so forth. Now, obviously, when it comes to assets, the higher end of the population has more of those than the lower end, who might typically be renting, don't have access to, to equity in their house and so forth. You've got that element. You've got an element when it comes to wage inflation that the higher income groups are generally doing better than the lower income groups. I go back to that point before. Strip out bonuses. Real wage inflation is down quite sharply. Include them in, which is the higher end of the population. Yeah, actually it's keeping pace with inflation. There was some data that was out recently was talking that in terms of I think pre-pandemic, wages at that point, which is around May 2022, wages are up around 15% on average. But for people in finance, they're up 25% from pre-pandemic levels. For people in IT and services, they're up 21 and 22%. So they have obviously done well. And then there is a third element here that when you look at inflation, actually inflation impacts more, or rather is higher for lower income groups than it is for higher income groups. And that's because the lower income groups are spending more of their disposable income on things, well, the question whether it's disposable, but more of their income on things such as energy and food. So the Institute of Fiscal Studies was talking about if you take the top decile in terms of wage earners in the country, the inflation rate for the 12 months to October 22, would be around 8%. If you actually took the bottom decile, their inflation rate was 14%. So you've got these real sort of mixture of things that are all really coming together. And that is why you've got the consumer that is reacting in different ways, where you can have sort of some companies say the consumer's feeling under pressure. As I said, you can have travel and entertainment going through the roof. You can have luxury sales going through the roof. You can have strong price inflation as well that's been able to push through. It's a real dichotomy in terms of the situation at the moment when it comes to the consumer.
And I suppose the other interesting thing is the level of help that we're seeing from the government, for example, with energy payouts, or I think now the energy cap is going to be reviewed, isn't it, more often, so 4 times a year rather than twice a year. So we're seeing, and the petrol price have dropped, there's talk of taxes changing, things like that. So there seems to be a bit more help this time around. Is there anything in kind of what in your experience of, the analysis on recessions? Is this different to other recessions, or is this kind of what we would expect to see?
No, I think it is. It is different, and there's a much wider question here as to whether, and this is, as I say, it's a much bigger topic. Whether more widely what we're seeing is the sort of end, as it were, the Reagan-Thatcher consensus, that essentially governments take the view of we let the markets do what they want and we don't intervene. And I think COVID in that regard was very much of a watershed. Yet the fact that governments effectively locked down economies, but then as a quid pro quo for that, recognised that what they had to provide was support to both firms and workers. And you think about the furlough scheme, 80% of a worker's wages being supported by the government up to a certain level, certainly above the average national wage. Loans that were provided for firms and so forth. And by and large, you would say, yes, there were issues with fraud, yes, the ways that scheme was executed. But by and large, it did its job. It prevented a large-scale collapse of the economy coming through. And so I think from that standpoint, what you're more likely to see moving forwards, a government's been a lot more interventionist when it comes to the consumer. And I think that will be both in direct ways. You say things such as energy subsidies and so forth. I think also as well more in indirect ways as well. So you can see things, for example, such as more support for the consumer, let's say, in terms of more support for renters, in terms of when they're of their protections vis-a-vis landlords. This is going to be a trend. It's not going to be a short-term trend. I think it will be a medium to longer-term trend moving forwards. And from a government standpoint, at the end of the day, what they're really concerned about is what happens in elections. And when we have a situation as we do in the moment where, as mentioned, the poorest members of society are the ones who've been most impacted by what's happened. And again, rising interest rates, if you are a mortgage holder but your income is not that great, you're going to get more impacted than if you were at the higher end of the scale, certainly in terms of being able to afford to pay your mortgage. There is a realization here that quite frankly, governments need to do something. So I think we will see more steps in terms of intervention.
So then what does this mean for brands? Because just as you have kind of different consumer groups being impacted in different ways, brands, depending on their situation, would be impacted in different ways. So what would you kind of expect to see there in terms of the differences in how a brand situation would be impacted?
Well, I think what you'll find, again, it will go back to this polarisation issue. I mean, one of the very interesting things that is coming from the both the Q1 and the first half results is that particularly when you look at the big, fast-moving consumer goods companies, but also across a range of different sectors, the ability to pass on costs to the consumer via price increases is actually a lot higher than the historical models would suggest. Now, there are some signs that is creaking. For example, you look at the results of US retailers, for example, a Walmart or a Target, they will talk about the fact that they're seeing several different types of consumers, all within their group. They've got some consumers who are actually scaling back to cheaper products when it comes to things like bacon and milk and so forth. They've got other consumers that are just going out and buying game consoles, and they're struggling to keep up with the demand. So there's a real sort of mixture here of things. I think for general mass market goods, probably what you will continue to see, and this has been very much the theme from the results, is that there is going to be there's going to be more price increases that are coming through, and generally the effects of those price increases will probably offset the volume decline, because again, the economic data is an average of a range of points, both the low end and the high end. And probably what you will see is at the low end, you're almost certainly going to see, in fact, you are starting to see right now, people scaling back to cheaper products. But when it comes to the higher end, I think now those price increases will be by and large accepted, because it comes back to this point before. If you're in a higher income household, generally you've built up savings during the pandemic, so you actually did well there. You're doing well in terms of your salary. You're doing well in terms of your asset values. Yes, you may complain that the price of beans is up by 30%, let's say, over the past 6 months. Is that really going to make a huge amount of difference to what you do? Probably not on things. So I think for brands, again, it would depend part by sector, sort of where they are. Travel, I think, should continue to do pretty well and so forth. But I think also as well where they sit when it comes to which end of the consumer they're really looking at.
And I guess there are always winners and losers, right? Always opportunities and challenges in these situations. I guess something I've personally found a bit of a challenge, I suppose, is almost differentiating between that personal, let's call it budgetary squeeze that you might have as a consumer, and then how you have to represent your brand, as an investor almost. So how do people kind of, if you are a marketer kind of living through this, everyone is in their own situation, how do you almost shift your mindset from consumer to investor as you're representing your brand and looking at investment and marketing decisions?
No, it's an excellent question. And funnily enough, I mean, you've seen variations of the same question. As you see in finance, where investors tend to look at their own, look at particular assets through the lens of their own perceptions. You see it, actually, I'd argue, you see it in advertising spend. Much of the advertising industry is based, owns one or two London. Maybe doesn't have let's say a sort of wide enough view of what's going on in the rest of the country. I think from a brand perspective, there are a couple of things here, again, to bear in mind. One is if you're working that point there, if you're working in the branding and advertising industry, you probably are in a minority, and you probably are sort of maybe not representative of the general population. So there has to be sort of a attention there to what consumers are thinking. And there will be a lot of data that will sort of looking at what's gone on before and will help brands and advertisers make the decisions as well. I think, there will be an element of sensitivity that will need to be applied on here. I go back to the luxury goods example. Yes, you may be doing well, but isn't necessarily a good thing to sort of shout out that message very loudly when you have sort of many people who are struggling sort of on here. And I'd argue in a way that, just as in, we had sort of 2020 beyond, sort of there was a lot of focus on there have been sort of DEI initiatives and also as well sort of ESG, environmental sustainability and governance issues. I think moving forwards as well, brands also as well will need a new leg of that campaign will need to be around sort of if you want to call it the class divide or the income divide between various consumer groups. That there are a lot of people who are struggling here. And I take a relatively optimistic view of things. I mean, my viewpoint is that, I think in terms of the recession that we won't get a hard landing. I think in terms of inflation, some of the, mentioned before, some of the inputs are actually coming down. You also have from next year, you also do have a comparables effect. So in terms of what you're basing next year's inflation rate off. So there is that particular issue as well. And I said the jobs data sort of remains quite strong. So I think another consideration, and that doesn't necessarily mean that's the right view, but I think another consideration that brands and people who work in marketing have to consider is to resist the tendency to do something sort of just almost in a panic way. Because there is always a temptation, particularly when you get with question marks about profitability. Do firms suddenly decide we need to cut our advertising spend because we want to protect the bottom line and so forth? And the problem is, particularly when it comes to brand advertising, is that once you get into this stop and start approach, then it actually takes a lot longer to actually get back to where you were. I mean, we've talked about this before in terms of the intangible capex sort of idea and so forth. This whole idea that brand advertising in particular is a long-term investment. It needs to be actually done through thick and thin, and sort of stopping and starting just really isn't the right approach.
Yeah, definitely. And I am hearing that as well, that budgets are starting to be kind of reviewed, marketing budgets. So what can someone do then if they're in that position where, obviously you've got all of the proof in your recent reports and analysis on how market investment drives long-term shareholder growth, but that might be quite difficult for people to prove or have those conversations in the boardroom as we hear. So is there anything that you would kind of suggest there? I know that you've been doing a lot of work with us on speaking the language of the CFO. Is there anything you can kind of advise for anyone in that situation where their budgets are being kind of questioned?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that would go to the heart of it, of saying, really recognizing what the priorities of the board, priorities of companies are. Data is obviously sort of a key point of that. And I think also as well, sort of making the argument that again, this needs to sort of get away from short-term thinking and really think of the long-term effect, because again, we don't know how long, we don't know whether we will be in a recession or not. As I said, if it's a recession, it's a strange kind of recession. Jobs data is strong. If you looked at the comments, for example, from the banks in the US, generally saying that essentially both consumers and businesses remain very strong, very, very healthy, across the board. So, what I would say is that marketeers, you have the data sort of presented in a way that boards and managements will understand, emphasize in terms of the long-term value that marketing delivers. And it's not just a theoretical thing. Yet the fact that so many of these FMCG companies are pushing through much greater price inflation than they thought, that should tell you that essentially, a brand that can do that has significant power. And the other thing would also emphasize sort of on this sort of, certainly on this longer term point, is that, when it comes to prices for firms, if firms can get their prices up to new elevated level now, that's a permanent level that's set moving forward. So it's a permanent gain. Whereas some of the input costs that have driven that, not all, but some of the input costs that have driven those price increases will eventually come off. So again, what you can do is that you can get advertising, particularly brand advertising, to support your brand during a recession. You can push through price increases to consumers. This is not just about a 6-month, 9-month effect. This is potentially a multi-year effect that will, doing that spend now, will generate far more return than making the short-term cut.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian. I mean, a moment of self-reflection, I suppose, for everyone, whether that's as an individual, as a brand, having a look at your business objectives, boardroom objectives, how can you really take an opportunity here rather than, considering it a challenge, if you like. So lots of resources that you've kind of helped us build to help people in terms of e-learning on how to speak the language of the CFO. Lots of kind of downloadable slides, research for everyone to use on our digital hub, changemakers.jcdecaux.co.uk. So please, hopefully all of our listeners, if you're in this situation, you're kind of looking to build that case for the boardroom and make sure your investment is protected, there's plenty for people to kind of download and use to help them. So thank you so much, Ian, for letting me interview you.
No, thanks so much.
And see you next time.
Indeed. See you then, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. Rajvi, thanks for turning the tables for today's episode. It certainly is an interesting time for the media industry and those who are making decisions around the future of their brands. We hope you enjoyed listening, and wherever you get your podcasts, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. For further resources, downloadable slides, and more information on all the topics covered in our podcasts, visit changemakers.jcdecaux.co.uk. You'll also find my short e-learning series there on how to speak the language of the CFO on the JCDecaux Digital Academy. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.